China is executing a 170-year revenge trade. We're at stage 4 of a 6-stage leverage reversal, and the collateral they're collecting isn't money. It's the same strategic assets Britain seized from them between 1839 and 1949. Picture this: Colombo, Sri Lanka, December 2017. Finance ministers reviewing a contract. The Hambantota port, built with a $1.4 billion Chinese loan the country can't repay, must be transferred for 99 years. The exact lease term Britain imposed on Hong Kong in 1898. The Chinese negotiators don't mention the historical parallel. They don't need to. The balance sheet does the talking. This isn't one port, it's 95 ports across 63 countries. It's over $1 trillion in infrastructure loans across 150 countries. It's a systematic acquisition of the same choke points that were used to humiliate China. The question isn't if China is restructuring global power. It's whether anyone recognizes the covenant clauses before the controls transfer is complete. This is stage 3 of the pattern: vendor financing deployment. Here's why this matters to you. When developing nations choose Chinese loans over Western loans, they're choosing infrastructure over governance reforms. That infrastructure gets built with Chinese steel, Chinese cement, Chinese labor. Your factory job doesn't come back because those countries just locked in Chinese suppliers for 30 years. The boardroom metaphor: China is offering bridge financing to distressed counterparties. The assets are countries that need $15 trillion in infrastructure, but can't access Western capital markets without accepting International Monetary Fund austerity programs. Let me be completely clear about how this works. Imagine you're in Addis Ababa, 2015. Ethiopian finance ministers reviewing 2 proposals for a new railway to Djibouti. World Bank offer: $3 billion, 15-year timeline, requires privatization of state telecom, independent anti-corruption oversight, environmental impact studies. China Railway Group offer: $4 billion, 6-year timeline, no political conditions. 70% of contract value returned as payment to Chinese firms. Here's how vendor financing, that's forced lending that creates dependency, actually works. Country A needs a port. China offers a loan at 2 to 3% interest, denominated in dollars. Sounds generous. Here's the structure: 70 to 85% of the loan value must be spent hiring Chinese firms. Those firms import Chinese workers, Chinese materials, Chinese equipment. The money flows out as a loan and flows right back as payment to Chinese state-owned enterprises. The borrower country gets infrastructure. China gets a customer locked into Chinese maintenance contracts, a commodity export market for overcapacity, a strategic asset with covenant clauses if the loan defaults, and political leverage from being the creditor. The contract terms aren't public, but leaked documents from Sri Lanka, Ecuador, and Kenya reveal 4 standard clauses. Chinese law governs disputes. Arbitration in Beijing. Borrower must maintain relations with the People's Republic of China. Borrower cannot seize Chinese assets, even in default. Britain, 1839, understood this mechanism. Qing China ran a trade surplus selling tea and silk, but Britain created artificial demand for opium to reverse the silver flow. Within 20 years, China was the distressed asset. China today identifies distressed counterparties the same way. Find the vulnerability, then offer the product that creates dependency. Here's what this means for you. 67 countries now owe more to China than to all Paris Club creditors combined. That's $1.3 trillion in leverage that didn't exist 15 years ago. Those countries vote in the United Nations. They host military bases. They control shipping lanes. When payment comes due and they can't pay, China gets policy concessions. What happens to third parties? Western construction firms lose bids. Local workers don't get trained because Chinese labor imports dominate. The IMF loses influence because they can't compete on price without abandoning governance conditions. Other developing countries watch and think, why accept austerity when China offers better terms? The incentive structure flips. Instead of reforming to access capital, countries maintain sovereignty, but trade strategic assets on default. You might be thinking, this is just development finance. China is helping poor countries build infrastructure the West refused to fund. Here's the problem with that assumption. The infrastructure isn't designed for the borrower's optimal use. See Sri Lanka's Hambantota port, built in the president's hometown district, no commercial shipping demand, hemorrhaging money from day one. The financial analysis was ignored because the loan funded political patronage. When default came, China didn't forgive debt. They converted it to a 99-year lease and operational control. This isn't charity, it's secured, lending with embedded optionality clauses. And that's just the lending phase. Stage 4 is where countries can't pay, and the conversion terms get enforced. This is Stage 4, distressed asset conversion. Here's why this matters to you. China now operates 95+ ports in 63 countries, handling 40% of global container traffic. Everything you buy that says made in Vietnam or made in Bangladesh probably moved through a Chinese-controlled port. If Beijing restricts access during a Taiwan crisis, those supply chains freeze in 72 hours. See what happened when just one ship blocked the Suez Canal. Now imagine intentional shutdowns across a network. Between 2013 and 2024, China didn't just lend money, they systematically acquired operational control of strategic nodes while everyone focused on the debt numbers. Athens, Greece, 2016. Costco acquires 67% stake in Piraeus Port for $368 million. European Commission approves it as a commercial transaction. What they didn't model. Piraeus is now the Mediterranean's third largest port. It's the gateway for Chinese goods entering Europe via rail through the Balkans. Costco invested $600 million more, tripled container volume, and now controls cargo routing decisions for southeastern Europe. The asset wasn't just a port, it was a node in an alternative logistics network. Here's how silent accumulation works across 3 asset classes. Physical infrastructure, ports aren't seized. They're leased via debt for equity swaps, covenant breach conversions where unpayable loans convert to operational control. Hambantota in Sri Lanka, Gwadar in Pakistan, Piraeus in Greece, Chancay in Peru. 99-year operational control agreements. The covenant package includes dredging rights, cargo handling monopoly, unrestricted vessel access, and in Pakistan's case, a 300 square kilometer special economic zone with Chinese security. Payment rails, CIPS. That's the cross-border interbank payment system. China's parallel clearing infrastructure processed $12.7 trillion in yuan transactions in 2023, up from $2 trillion in 2020. It's not replacing SWIFT yet. It's providing insurance against SWIFT sanctions. Russia got cut off from SWIFT in 2022. Yuan trade with China continued via CIPS without interruption. Technology standards. Huawei built 5G networks in over 170 countries. Each installation creates vendor lock-in. Chinese equipment requires Chinese maintenance, Chinese software updates, Chinese component supply chains. The United Kingdom tried removing Huawei and discovered replacement costs over $7 billion across a decade. Britain 1842 to 1860 operated this way. After forcing open treaty ports, British firms quietly accumulated control. Shipping monopolies, customs administration, riverine patrol rights. By 1860, China hadn't been invaded again, but foreigners controlled cash flow choke points. China today accumulates the same way. Ports, payment rails, rare earth, refinement, quiet control before crisis reveals dependency. Here's what this means for you. If you think sanctions are leverage America can use against China, look at the reverse dependency. The US sanctioned Russia. Oil prices spiked. Americans paid $5 per gallon. Now imagine sanctioning your largest trading partner who controls port access for 40% of global trade and manufactures 70% of your consumer goods. The cost is catastrophic. China accumulated assets specifically to make Western sanctions self-destructive. Third countries watching this accumulation face a choice: align with the country that controls their port, or align with the country threatening sanctions that would shut down that port. Kenya's position: Mombasa Port operated by China Merchant Holdings. US says don't recognize Chinese claims in South China Sea. China doesn't say anything. They just control the port where 90% of Kenya's imports arrive. The leverage is silent, structural, and compounds daily. You might be thinking, these are commercial leases. Countries can nationalize if they want. Here's the problem. The contracts use Chinese law and Beijing arbitration. Clause 8.5 in the Hambantota lease. The government shall not interfere with, obstruct, or impede the operations of the port. Ecuador tried to audit a Chinese dam contract. China threatened to call the entire $7.3 billion bilateral loan. Ecuador backed down within 48 hours. Sovereignty in contract law depends on enforcement. China has $1.3 trillion in leverage. The borrowers have debt service obligations. That's the asset accumulation. Now comes Stage 5, parallel infrastructure activation. The alternative system goes live. We're entering Stage 5, parallel infrastructure activation. We've now completed 4 of 6 stages. Here's why this matters to you. The US tried sanctioning Chinese tech companies. China responded by accelerating domestic semiconductor production and restricting rare earth exports. Your iPhone costs more because Apple can't source components at previous prices. Sanctions work when you have alternatives. When you don't, they're just price increases on yourself. The boardroom reality, the West's poison pill defense. Sanctions, tech export controls, alliance diversification, assumes China needs Western systems more than the West needs Chinese manufacturing. That assumption broke in 2022. 2 moments expose the failure. Moment 1, October 2022. US imposes semiconductor export controls. ASML in the Netherlands can't sell extreme ultraviolet lithography machines to China. Western analysts celebrate. China's chip industry is finished. Moment 2, August 2023. Huawei releases Mate 60 Pro with 7nm chip made by SMIC using entirely Chinese equipment. Western export controls didn't stop development. They just removed Western firms from the most lucrative market. Here's how the poison pill strategy fails across 3 components. Component 1, financial decoupling. US pushed the G7 to match or exceed Chinese infrastructure lending. Announced $600 billion partnership for global infrastructure in 2022. By 2024, only $40 billion deployed. Why? Western countries required democratic governance conditions, environmental impact reviews taking 2 to 3 years, competitive bidding that extends timelines, private capital participation that reduces government outlays. China's Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank operates differently. Over $200 billion deployed since 2016. Average approval time, 6 months, no governance conditions. The West can't compete on speed without abandoning principles, and borrowing countries choose speed. Component 2, technology restrictions. The small yard, high fence strategy restricts Chinese access to cutting-edge chips, AI training clusters, quantum computing. The theory, China can't innovate without Western tech. The reality, China graduates 4.7 million STEM students annually versus 820,000 in the US. Restriction accelerates their state-directed development. See results. BYD now sells more electric vehicles than Tesla, built entirely on Chinese battery tech. DeepSeek AI rivals. GPT-4 using domestic chips. Commercial Aircraft Corporation, COMAC, reports over 1,200 orders for the C919, a Boeing alternative. Component 3, alliance diversification, friendshoring. The theory, move supply chains to allied countries like Vietnam, India, Mexico to reduce China dependency. The problem, those countries import components from China. Vietnam's electronics exports, estimates suggest 60% Chinese intermediate inputs. India's smartphone production, approximately 75% Chinese components. Mexico's auto sector, Chinese battery cells. You didn't eliminate dependency. You added a margin and a shipping step. Qing China 1858 tried this. attempted to resist British demands by restricting opium trade, arresting British merchants. Britain responded with naval bombardment, forced the Treaty of Tientsin, doubled the concessions. China learned, resistance without alternative leverage makes position worse. The West today attempts sanctions, tech bans, de-risking. Each move accelerates Chinese counter-infrastructure without addressing core dependency. Here's what this means for you. Every Made in Vietnam label hides Chinese inputs. Every tariff on Chinese goods raises costs on yourself unless you've rebuilt the entire supply chain domestically. The US hasn't built a major semiconductor fabrication plant in 20 years until TSMC's Arizona plant in 2024. Meanwhile, China has installed hundreds of fabs. The gap widened during decoupling. The unintended consequence: US export controls unified Chinese state and private sector around self-sufficiency. Before restrictions, Chinese tech firms preferred buying ASML machines for better performance. After restrictions, SMIC got unlimited state funding for domestic alternatives. You created the competitor by removing the easier option. Now we have to address the elephant in the room, the one vulnerability that could break China's mechanism: the demographic cliff. Population peaked in 2022, aging faster than any society in history. By 2035, over 400 million people over 60. The get rich before you get old window is closing. If internal consumption collapses before external leverage fully deploys, the model breaks. But the timeline favors China, 10 to 12 years before demographic crisis hits, versus 30+ years to rebuild Western manufacturing. You might be thinking, companies are moving production to India, Vietnam, Mexico. Diversification is working. Here's the problem with that assumption. You're confusing assembly with supply chain control. Apple assembled iPhones in India, the display, battery, advanced chips, precision components, still Chinese or Chinese-owned through Taiwan's Foxconn. You moved the final 15% of value add. China still controls 70% of inputs. Real diversification requires domestic component manufacturing, raw material processing, advanced machinery production. That's 15 to 20 years of investment the West hasn't started. The West's countermeasures failed. That was stage 5. Stage 6 is where the governance transfer becomes explicit, where debt becomes policy. This is stage 6, governance transfer. The pattern says this is where control becomes explicit. Here's why this matters to you. When 67 countries owe China more than they owe all Western creditors combined, their voting patterns change. UN votes on Xinjiang. Reports indicate 45 countries defend China. South China Sea disputes? Over 90 countries abstain or support Chinese claims. That's not persuasion. That's creditor leverage translating to policy alignment. Your government can't build coalitions against Chinese actions when the coalition members are debt-trapped. Belgrade, Serbia, 2020. President Aleksandar Vučić announces EU integration is still a priority, then signs 21 bilateral agreements with China, worth $11.3 billion. The fine print reveals the mechanism. Chinese firms build Belgrade-Budapest high-speed rail. Serbia must guarantee minimum passenger volume or pay China the difference. Exempt Chinese workers from local labor law. Waive environmental regulations in construction zones. Support One China policy on Taiwan. It's not aid, it's a purchase agreement for policy positions. The control transfer operates through 3 covenant structures. First, debt covenant enforcement. When countries can't pay, restructuring negotiations aren't about haircuts, reducing principal. They're about policy concessions. Kenya, 2019. Mombasa, Nairobi, railway debt restructured. New terms. Kenya must provide police protection for Chinese workers, exempt Chinese firms from local procurement rules, and support Chinese positions in African Union votes. Ecuador, 2018. $7.3 billion in debt to China. Development Bank. Restructuring includes guaranteed oil exports to China at reportedly below market rates for 15 years. Approval of Chinese military vessel port calls. Support for Beijing on human rights resolutions. Pakistan ongoing. the $62 billion China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Terms include 91% profit share to Chinese firms from Gwadar Port, 23% rate of return guaranteed to Chinese power projects. Pakistan pays the shortfall. Chinese security personnel allowed on Pakistani soil. Second, technology sovereignty transfer. Countries that accept Chinese 5G and surveillance infrastructure accept data governance by Beijing. Kenya. Huawei built the standard gauge railway digital control system. All operational data flows through Chinese servers. Kenya learned after installation that they can't access source code or modify systems without Huawei approval. Ecuador. The ECU 911 surveillance system, video cameras, facial recognition, built entirely by Chinese firms. Data storage, algorithm training, system access controlled from Shenzhen servers. The vendor lock-in becomes de facto governance. You can't monitor your own infrastructure without Chinese approval. Third, alliance obligation reversal. Countries shift from Western security guarantees to Chinese economic security guarantees. Cambodia, Ream Naval Base, leased to Chinese military 2020 to 2099. Refuses U.S. Navy port calls while hosting People's Liberation Army Navy vessels. Solomon Islands, Security Pact allows Chinese police deployment and military base construction. Terminated 80-year alliance with Australia. Qing China 1895 to 1911 experienced this. After losing the Sino-Japanese War, China borrowed from European banks to pay reparations. The loans came with concessions, customs revenue pledged to foreign creditors. Imperial Maritime Customs, run by British officials, railway and mining rights surrendered. Debt became governance. Today's pattern, Ecuador's constitution, changed to allow foreign military bases. Cambodia banned opposition parties critical of China. Zambia suppressed labor strikes at Chinese mines. Here's what this means for you. The U.S. has over 750 military bases in 80 countries. Each base exists because the host nation agreed. When those nations owe China over $100 billion and depend on Chinese infrastructure financing for development, the base agreements become negotiable. Philippines hosts U.S. forces under Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. China is Philippines' largest trading partner and holds billions in infrastructure loans. During the next South China Sea confrontation, which leverage weighs more? Third countries see the trade-off. Accept Chinese debt plus infrastructure, plus market access, plus no political conditions, but lose ability to criticize China. Or accept Western aid plus conditions, plus slower disbursement, plus democratic reform requirements, plus freedom to criticize. Most choose the first option. Why? Political leaders maximize short-term development, ribbon cuttings, visible projects, over long-term sovereignty, which remains abstract and invisible until crisis. You might be thinking, these are sovereign nations. They can refuse Chinese demands and accept the economic consequences. Here's the problem. Sri Lanka tried. 2018, new government attempted to renegotiate Hambantota port terms. China's response: pay $6 billion immediately or accept the lease. Sri Lanka didn't have $6 billion. They had 60 days of foreign reserves. The lease was signed. The leverage gap is too wide when you owe $8 billion and have $3 billion in total reserves. The governance transfer is underway. That was Stage 4 executed. Now Stage 5 accelerates. The alternative system goes live, and the old system becomes optional. This is the final stage, controlling shareholder reality. Here's why this matters to you. Over 130 countries now trade more with China than with the AE or United States. When the largest trading partner says use yuan for settlement, what leverage does the US have? Sanctions? You just sanctioned your own trade. The question isn't whether China is restructuring global power. 4 stages are complete. The question is whether the transition becomes explicit via crisis or implicit via gradual acceptance. Beijing, March 2023. Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin signed joint statement. We will expand the use of national currencies in mutual settlements strengthen cooperation within BRICS, and promote the establishment of a new world order. Not a declaration of war, a balance sheet announcement. Russia sells oil to China in yuan. China provides yuan to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia buys Chinese infrastructure with yuan. The petrodollar system, the foundation of dollar dominance since 1974, starts leaking. The new reality operates on three parallel systems. First, trade settlement bypass. Over 40 countries now conduct direct yuan local currency, swaps, skipping dollars. Brazil-China trade, $150 billion annually, with reports of 90% settled in yuan and real by 2024. Russia-China trade, $200 billion annually, reportedly 100% non-dollar post-sanctions. Saudi Arabia piloting yuan acceptance for oil sales as of 2023. Each bilateral agreement reduces dollar transaction demand by $50 to $200 billion annually. Death by 1,000 cuts. Second, alternative infrastructure online. CIPS processed $12.7 trillion in 2023. Still 1/8 of SWIFT's volume, but growing 35% annually versus SWIFT's 4%. The crossover point, 2031 to 2033, at current trajectories. Digital yuan trials in over 260 cities, over 200 million users. When China mandates foreign firms use digital yuan for domestic transactions, they're forced onto a payment rail that Beijing can monitor and restrict. Third, governance transfer complete. The Belt and Road Forum 2023 had 151 countries attend. G7 Summit 2023 had to invite India, Brazil, Indonesia as observers because their absence made G7 irrelevant to the global majority. The votes that matter are shifting. UN climate finance. China pledged $450 billion, reportedly delivered $250 billion. US pledged $300 billion, reportedly delivered $90 billion. Credibility follows cash. Britain, 1949, provides the mirror. Pound sterling was still the world's second reserve currency. London was still a financial center. The Commonwealth still existed. But the decisions were made in Washington. Marshall Plan dollars set European policy. IMF and World Bank, US dominated, controlled global finance. Britain kept the symbols but lost the authority. Today, dollar is still 58% of global reserves. SWIFT still dominates. But yuan direct trade settlement doubled in 3 years. The transition doesn't announce itself. You only notice when the old system stops working. Bottom line, here's what this means for you. Dollar reserve status is the only reason the US can run $2 trillion deficits without austerity. Foreign central banks buy treasuries because they need dollars for trade. When trade settles in yuan, they don't need dollars. Treasury demand falls. To fund deficits, the Federal Reserve prints money, monetization. Your savings lose value via inflation. The cost is staggering. Going from 58% reserve share to 40% equals $3 trillion less foreign treasury demand. That's either $3 trillion in spending cuts or 15 to 20% inflation. You might be thinking, the dollar has been the reserve currency for 80 years. Inertia is powerful. True. But Britain's pound was reserve currency for over 100 years. The transition to dollar dominance took 25 years, 1920s to 1945. We're 15 years into yuan internationalization. Historical timelines favor China. The question is whether you notice before your portfolio reprices. The mechanism is locked in. The only variable is timing, and whether recognition comes before restructuring or after. 4 stages complete. 2 remain. China isn't trying to replace the American system overnight. They're building the alternative infrastructure while you're still dependent on the current system. When the transition becomes obvious, it will already be negotiated. The historical mirror is exact. Britain took 99-year leases from China. China is taking 99-year leases from the world. Britain used opium, addictive consumption, as leverage. China uses infrastructure, necessary development, as leverage. The The covenant clauses are already signed. The only question is whether you notice before the refinancing deadline or after the asset transfer is complete.